Welcome back to problems 10 through 12 for part 1. So we've got a sine x plus sine x over tangent x. Well, remember when I said that sometimes it's helpful to see if you can factor something out? Well, notice that you can factor out a sine x of both sides. Out of both terms. And when we do, we get 1 plus 1 over tangent squared x. Then looking at 1 over tangent squared x, we know that's equal to cotangent x squared. Then looking at our identities, we know that 1 plus cotangent squared x is equal to cosecant squared x. And cosecant is 1 over sine, so cosecant squared is 1 over sine squared. A sine on the top cancels out with a sine on the bottom. We get 1 over sine x, which is equal to cosecant x. Okay, for number 11, I look and I really don't see anything I can factor out. At this point, I could find a common denominator, and that could be helpful. But for this, I'm going to go ahead and just change everything into sine and cosine. So cosecant, I know, is 1 over sine. And I know that is cosine over sine. And tangent is sine over cosine. Now I've noticed that some of the students are having difficulty simplifying these. So just go ahead and treat them just like fractions. So I get 1 over sine x times the reciprocal, which is 1 over sine x, which gives me 1 over sine x squared. And then for this one, I get cosine x over sine x times the reciprocal of sine x over cosine x, which gives me cosine squared x over sine squared x. Since we now have a common denominator, we can combine the fractions. From our previous problems, we know that 1 minus cosine squared is sine squared. And sine squared divided by sine squared is 1. Number 12. A lot of you had the right idea for the first step. You saw this sine squared and this minus 1, and you immediately thought of cosine squared. Well, sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. But if I subtract sine squared from both sides, I get 1 minus sine squared, not sine squared minus 1. So one way to solve this is I could simply subtract 1 from both sides. And then subtract cosine squared from both sides. So we can see that sine squared minus 1 is not equal to cosine squared, but negative cosine squared. So here, these cosine squareds do cancel, leaving us with a negative sine squared. So now you look at it like, well, it's supposed to be tangent squared times sine squared. Yet we have a negative sine squared plus tangent squared. Well, let's just get everything into sine and cosine. Now, we can factor out a sine squared. And we get negative 1 plus 1 over cosine squared. And I know that the reciprocal of cosine squared is secant squared. And just to make this look a little more familiar, that's secant squared minus 1. And secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. So I get sine squared, tangent squared, which is what I was looking for. And that concludes part 1.